Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today we have another exciting show for you, and I might even go on record as saying it has a chance to be one of the most exciting episodes ever, because we're going to be talking about policy. Everyone loves a good policy conversation, and obviously I say that kind of joking with my guest here, and it is. We have a new guest, but this truly will be, I hope, a very informative, very exciting episode for you. We have talked about policy before, but we're going to come at this again now this year in 2021 and kind of recap some of the important achievements that we made over the past year and just kind of give another overview of what it is that Ducks Unlimited does with policy and its importance. And our guest here today is Zach Hartman, our Chief Policy Officer. Zach, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. It's awesome to be here.
I think this is your first time back here, isn't it?
It is my first time on the DU podcast.
I think the first time that we had Adam, our CEO, on, actually, I think Chris was interviewing him. Adam kind of gave Chris a bit of grief for not having him on anytime sooner. So I think it may have even been longer since in your case. But we are happy to have you here, happy to get you here talking about some of the important achievements that we made over the past year that you and your team have. And so you are new, relatively new still to Ducks Unlimited. So I want to start out by giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself, your kind of personal and professional background, and kind of introduce yourself to our listeners here. Tell us about yourself, Zach.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. And I'm not going to give anybody a hard time. I'm just grateful to be here. It's worth the wait. But my background, I think it's important to start with, how we fell in love with the outdoors. That's a common thread that we pull through every member of the team here at DU. And it really started for me on the waters of Sarasota Bay. I grew up the son of a fishing guide. When I was a kid, he was a high school teacher and a baseball coach. But he's a fishing guide now at the ripe old age of 73. He did, I think, 3 tarpon charters a few weeks ago. So he's still out there cranking it. I hope I'm as healthy as he is at that age. But, spent every weekend of my life, every free minute fishing with my dad, my uncle, in the waters of Central Florida for largemouth bass and the waters of Sarasota Bay for snook, redfish, trout, pompano, whatever we could catch, and tarpon in the season. And so, it was really great because that's something that you kind of carry with you for your whole life. And when I moved up north for college, I started needing something to do outdoors in the wintertime. In Florida, we just fish all year. And so I started getting into hunting a lot more with my cousins, first for doves and then later with ducks, and just really have developed a huge love for that. So DU has been a very good logical fit for me. But, I went to college at the University of Georgia, and as well as some of our other senior leadership staff here.
So you are an SEC alumnus.
Go Dogs, yes. SEC alumnus. The SEC is growing. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I guess
it's a topic for another episode, I believe.
We can make a little room for the Longhorns and the Sooners. But after I graduated from college with a degree in education, I had an opportunity to work for a lobbying firm in Atlanta. And so I worked there for 2 years doing legislative advocacy in Atlanta, and then moved to Washington, D.C., where I lived before I moved to Memphis to work for DU. In Washington, I worked for a member of Congress, then another member of Congress that was elected to the Senate, then worked for him for a while, handling a lot of his agriculture and natural resources legislation. And then after that, I worked as the Director of Federal Affairs for Anheuser-Busch, which is a great partner of Ducks Unlimited. Don't forget, Busch Beer is the official beer of the Ducks.
That is correct.
Go out and get some.
Yeah.
And worked there for 5.5 years before joining the team at DU. But while I was at Anheuser-Busch, I was working on a lot of their federal policy, really kind of across the board. They're a huge manufacturing company, huge agribusiness, but really focusing on working with agribusiness stakeholders on sustainability and other initiatives like that could pull us together. So great opportunity to have worked for a great company there, but really glad to be here at Ducks Unlimited.
And remind me, Zach, how long have you been here with us?
I started at Ducks Unlimited in October of 2019. So coming up a little over a year and a half.
Several of us here, myself, I mean, I've actually worked for DU for what, close to 16 years, maybe a little bit over that. I lose count, but I've been here at headquarters since around summer, early fall of 2019, and some of our other chiefs and CEOs. There's been a fair bit of kind of turnover here among some of the folks at headquarters, certainly in our chief positions. And so we're still trying to get caught up on having every one of them here on the podcast. I think Dr. Karen Waldrop has yet to make her appearance on this as well, our Chief Conservation Officer, but we'll get her on at some point. But
well, at least I beat her here.
That's right. So, but it certainly sounds like your background, both your personal background, your professional background, prepares you very well for the work that you do here with Ducks Unlimited. And that's what we want to transition to now. And like I said, kind of recap. Well, we'll do two things. We'll give you an opportunity to talk big picture about the importance of policy in Ducks Unlimited and kind of talk about some of your staff and some of your team. But then we want to transition to talking about accomplishments from this past year. We're recording this particular episode here in late August, just kind of for a timestamp to give people something to reference. And policy from your perspective, and this is always fun to kind of get the different perspective from people that we talk to. Everyone seems to have a unique little twist or a unique little vision, the way they see it, which is pretty cool. So I've said on some previous episodes and talking with people that conservation without funding is just conversation. And so the work that you do and your team does in policy is absolutely critical in helping to provide some of those funding streams. So but it goes well beyond that. So I'm going to toss it over to you now and tell us, big picture, the importance of policy, why do we invest in it, and even you can get into a little bit of the history of DU's policy efforts if you'd like to.
Yeah, sure, Mike. I appreciate that. DU policy is really a really critical part of the recipe of what DU does. Our volunteers are our secret ingredient. We know that for sure. And so, I really view policy work as we're support. It was funny when I was at Anheuser-Busch, I said, we're a beer company. There are people that make and sell the beer, and then everybody else is support. It's not that much different here at DU. We have so many great professional staff and volunteers that support our conservation delivery machine, but do it in a lot of different ways. Our fundraising team supports conservation by raising unrestricted revenue and restricted revenue for conservation delivery. And policy does the same because our conservation delivery apparatus, if you will, is so interconnected with state agencies for fish and wildlife, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with FEMA, with NOAA, with the Department of Defense, with all these different agencies are essential partners for us in our role of delivering waterfowl habitat on the ground. And they all have very important needs and goals and priority, as do we. And a lot of times those line up. And so what policy does is we go out and we work with those partners in our federal and state agencies, and we work with our other stakeholders. Maybe they're agribusiness groups. Maybe they're corporations. We work with them on all of our shared priorities and influencing public policy so that DU and our conservation staff have the resources at their disposal to deliver that conservation on the ground. Maybe there's a great program that would be really awesome for waterfowl habitat, but we're not really eligible because this regulation says one thing or this law says another thing. And if we can tweak that a little bit, then it becomes a really great funding source for conservation. And so we're really out here trying to protect and grow our core programs and also broaden the base of opportunities for conservation to pursue so that they have lots of options and just the right option for that project that they want to deliver on the landscape.
So a lot of those programs that you talk about are responsible for providing funding to do some of the habitat work that Ducks Unlimited is so great at. But are there other things that some of our policy efforts can do with regard to like ensuring some of the decisions that policymakers are entertaining are I guess, friendly to the things that we like to do that help protect wetlands and uplands and help protect habitats that are beneficial for waterfowl? Are there things beyond funding, I guess is what I'm trying to ask, that we use policy for?
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you asked that question. You know, it really starts with DU brand reputation. And there's a lot of times where you find otherwise very well-intended legislators bring a bill forward that does something that they don't intend it to do. And we have to connect with them and say, hey, you know, there was a bill last year that inadvertently would have made it illegal to hunt waterfowl in one state. And when we contacted the legislator and we're like, do you realize what this does? They were like, whoa, I totally didn't. I'm going to withdraw that. And so that's what our team does. But, you know, also working with these policymakers to keep things pointed in the right direction. You know, the history of DU policy really started with the North American Wildlife Management Plan. Or NAWCA, as all the conservation staff will call it. But since we're dealing with a lot of laypersons out here, myself included, you know, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan was created in the late 80s. And as an extension of that, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, which is one of the most impactful waterfowl habitat conservation programs out there, was created in the early 90s. And what that was is it was born out of this realization by Ducks Unlimited and the broader conservation community that waterfowl conservation is not going to be something that is dealt with between individuals anymore as much. It's really something that is going to be born out of the relationship between countries, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It's a continental program. And also born out of the idea that it's going to be conservation and waterfowl management is going to be born out of relationships between governments and individuals. And so if we're really going to succeed in protecting and promoting our waterfowl traditions and succeed at delivering waterfowl habitat on the ground, we really needed to lean into these relationships with legislators and our policy makers. And so it doesn't necessarily stop at the legislator. We also spend a lot of time interacting and working with what opinion elites, key stakeholders, people who might have more influence over certain aspects of policy than we do, and working with them on our common priorities. Because at the end of the day, when you think about policy, we watch the 24-hour news cycle. There's so much that looks like the country can't agree on anything. That what divides us is so much greater than what unites us. And nothing could really be further from the truth. There's, you know, especially when it comes to the desired outcomes, we have, as a nation, we really have 90% or so alignment in all the things that the government is doing. And what we try to do is focus on that 90% and make sure that DU and the ducks and waterfowl habitat conservation stays in that 90% category.
We'll pick that up here in just a minute, but the first thing I want to do is kind of go back. You referenced your policy team, and I want to make sure that we give some mention, some credit to them because it's more than just you.
100%.
And so tell our listeners, for those that may not be aware, about our policy team in Washington, D.C., but then we also have some policy folks in the different regional offices, right?
Absolutely. I cannot say enough great things about our policy team.
Except Ed Penny. Let's not throw too much praise on Ed Penny.
Ed Penny gets it done. You know, you're always fortunate if you're the target of one of those things because, as we say in the D.C. office, we kid because we care.
That's right.
Right. But we're really blessed with an amazing professional staff, but also an amazing policy volunteer army, if you will. We've got a DC office that handles all the federal stuff. That's probably what most people are familiar with. But we've also got 6 professional staff members located in our regional offices around the U.S. As you mentioned, Ed Penny is in the southern region. We have a new hire in California, Mark Engstrom, who handles our California policy out of the WRO. We have 2 team members out of the Bismarck office, Carmen Miller and Ryan Taylor. And then we've got 2 professional staff in our Glero office. We've got Kyle Aurora and Nikki Gorpade, and they just do an amazing job working with our volunteers. You know, I joke around with folks. I say, you know, my title is Chief Policy Officer, but I'm really just the Chief Policy Advocate. They're all great professionals at what they do. I'm here at national headquarters to coordinate everything with the national leadership and to make sure that our people in the field, staff and volunteers, have the resources they need to bring home what is necessary for the conservation on the landscape.
Your job is to stay out of their way, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
So Zach, one thing I want to pull out of that, what you were just talking about there, is the role that our volunteers play in our policy efforts. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Our policy volunteers are like everything else in DEU. Our volunteers are our secret ingredient in this recipe for delivering this conservation. You know, it really starts with the Public Policy Committee, which is led by Al Matna, who is our policy committee chairman. We have about 20 or so policy committee members, and they are the ones that provide the vision and the continuity across our volunteer leadership for what policy is supposed to go and do. But we also have state-based and regional-based policy volunteer leaders who play an essential role in delivering and working on our policy priorities in Washington and in the states. And so many of our states have state policy chairs that serve beneath the state chairs to make sure that they're coordinating all of the folks who are interested in policy out there across the United States and keeping them focused on the things that we want to do. You know, our volunteers are our secret ingredient, but not every volunteer wants to volunteer for an event, or not every volunteer wants to volunteer on a conservation project. There are a lot of people who are political junkies out there, just like me, who really love getting into that sort of thing. And they might not be interested in volunteering to organize a gun bash or something like that, but they are interested in this. And so this is another way that folks can get involved in DEU and be a volunteer for DEU. And I think that that's great. And they do that by participating in legislative meetings at their state capitals or Washington, D.C. They do that by responding to our action alerts and contacting their member of Congress in the House or the Senate, or also in the state legislature or their governors about important policy issues as they arise, and participating in fly-ins and other types of events. One of the most important things that our policy volunteers really do, and I don't want to overlook this because it is essentially important, it is the most high value thing that our policy volunteers do, is that they meet with legislators and their staff at our conservation projects. So nothing makes an impression on a legislator than when one of their constituents says, I'm a volunteer for DU. We just did this great project. It's going to create all this clean water. It's going to create all this waterfowl habitat. It's going to create all this outdoor recreation access. And here it is in your district. I'd love for you to come so I can show it to you. And they go and they come away, and then they are always there for us when we need them.
That's a great point, Zach. And we have, anytime we talk about the role of waterfowl hunters and conservationists in the history of funding and promoting good policy for wildlife conservation in general, it's more than just license sales. It's more than just duck stamps. It's more than just donations to nonprofit organizations. It's the thing that you just talked about there, where they are invested enough, they are passionate enough about the resource, waterfowl, wetlands in this case, to spend their time seeking out a conversation with their legislators, their representatives, to let them know that it matters to them. And then they're going to, quite frankly, part of their vote is going to be based on those types of decisions and those types of issues, and that's a really critical thing to emphasize. And so I'm glad you did so.
100%. If we can make sure that every one of our members, legislators, know that they are a duck voter, then we are already way ahead of the curve. And so it's essential that engagement. They're ambassadors is what they are. They're ambassadors for DU. They're brand ambassadors. They're ambassadors for all waterfowlers.
Let's transition to talking about accomplishments, which are partly attributable to those hunters, those individuals, our supporters. And we're going to reflect back on some of the accomplishments of last year. And a few minutes ago, you talked about issues that unite us versus issues that divide us. And the thing that's always kind of struck me is, regardless of which kind of political administration we may find ourselves in, conservation issues, the desire to leave the landscape and natural resources a bit better than we found them, is something that in nearly every case transcends political boundaries. And that's got to be, I mean, I don't work in the political field. I'm a scientist, but nevertheless, as I think about it, I have to imagine that you, for the people, the professionals in the policy arena, to be able to work on something that you know resonates with both Republicans, Democrats, independents, that has to make your job really easy. Not necessarily really easy, but easier than some of the more divisive topics, right?
It does. You know, we're not manufacturing widgets here. We're manufacturing ducks, and it's complicated, right? And so, but the conservation space is one that really is unifying, and we're just so grateful for that. It's DU is a nonpartisan organization, so we work very hard to protect our DU brand reputation as somebody that is inclusive and inviting of people of all political persuasions. There's nothing. There are duck politics, but there's nothing political about ducks, and we're really fortunate. As a matter of fact, last Congress, when the country was as divided as I think it has ever been, based off of what people watch on the news and see from home, you'd think that politicians in Washington and in their state capitals couldn't agree on anything. Yet, we were able to pass two of the biggest, most landmark legislative packages for conservation in the history of the country. The Great American Outdoors Act was one, and America's Conservation Enhancement Act was another. Conservation was what was the glue that held those big deals together and created that bipartisan committee that enabled those bills to advance, because in this divisive environment, legislators needed to show that the government could function, and they were looking for things that they could do. And our team, as well as all of our conservation partners in Washington, did an exceptional job of advocating and advancing these big legislative priorities that are going to make a difference in this country for generations.
Let's talk about some of those in a bit more detail here, Zach. And I know you could roll off 20 or so examples of the type of accomplishments that we made, your policy team made, and our volunteers made over the past year. But if I had to ask you to identify 3 to 4, let's stick with 3 or 4 of the most notable accomplishments at the federal level. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about some of the examples from the state level here later on, but some of the most prominent examples at the federal level.
Yeah, so the 2 bills that I just mentioned are definitely the most impactful. First of all, the Great American Outdoors Act was passed last year, which permanently authorized and made funding mandatory for the Land and Water Conservation Fund to the tune of about $900 million a year. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is a fund that has been authorized up to a certain amount, but typically appropriated at much lower levels. So making that funding mandatory, in other words, the government has to spend it, was a huge accomplishment. The other reason that was so great is because DU historically has not taken advantage of the Land and Water Conservation Fund a lot. There are a lot of state agencies that don't really understand how to apply for the programs. The programs have different types of requirements around multiple uses and other things like that. But that's just another reason that is such a great opportunity for DU, because it enables us to leverage all the benefits that waterfowl habitat provides. And so maybe a Land and Water Conservation Fund program might not just restore wetland habitat. It might expand a state WMA and also include construction of a sporting clays course or a dog training facility or some other form of outdoor recreational access. And what that is going to mean is more outdoor recreation and more dollars for conservation in the form of excise taxes on sporting goods equipment, particularly hunting and fishing equipment and other things like that. So the Great American Outdoors Act was huge. It also included, aside from just the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a tremendous amount of money for our national parks. Our national parks are underwhelmed and undermaintained, or overwhelmed and undermaintained, especially in the current environment. People are trying to get outdoors more than ever. And so that's going to provide essential maintenance funding for our national parks and to take care of all their visitors there.
Perhaps an opportunity for a little bit of policy 101. You mentioned a couple of terms early on in when talking about that act. Authorization versus appropriation. Can you give us the simple explanation of the difference between those two? How often do they have to occur? And why are both of them critical to policy actions actually being implemented?
That's a great question. And I think that we take that a little bit for granted inside the policy universe, that people really understand that, but it's worth pointing out. And so the difference between authorization and appropriation is kind of like this. Let's say you are sitting around the kitchen table going through your family budget with your wife, and you're saying, we're going to budget X number of dollars to get a new pickup truck.
Okay.
That's the authorization.
Okay. We're authorized to make the purchase.
Yeah. And I know Mike has expensive taste, so we're going to say $65,000.
No, let's not go there.
And then the appropriation of that is when you actually spend it. You go to the dealership, but you might not spend $65,000. You might spend 56. That's a nice truck, by the way.
You can't be talking about my truck, the one that hasn't been washed in a year.
But that's really the difference. Authorization authorizes, appropriation spend. And authorizing bills happen on an annual basis sometimes. Sometimes they happen on a 5-year cycle. A lot of big bills like North American Wetlands Conservation Act is a 5-year authorization at a certain level. I'll talk more about that when I get into details of the ACE Act, the American Conservation Enhancement Act. But the appropriations happen on an annual basis, and the authorization sets the maximum amount that can be spent on a particular program, and the appropriation sets the actual amount that they're going to spend on it this year. So, for example, under the previous authorization, NAWCA, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, was authorized for $50 million. But it was appropriated for $46.5 million. So it doesn't always hit that cap. The idea on a 5-year authorization like that is to incrementally work your way up to that maximum authorization level.
And just because a program is authorized does not mean it's going to receive funding, right?
That's correct. Unless it's mandatory spending, it does not mean that it is going to have money spent on it. Those programs are referred to as discretionary programs.
So that's why we work so hard within Ducks Unlimited for both the authorization of NAWCA as well as the annual appropriations, right?
100%. And we spend a lot of time demonstrating support for these programs through congressional letters, signing on. And so our NAWCA letter typically has more than 200 signees in the House and more than 50 in the Senate year to year. And so we continue to try to grow those numbers to make it abundantly clear to Republicans and Democrats that there is a broad swath of the country that supports these letters, both in Congress and out across America.
So I'm kind of causing us to jump around here a little bit. We've talked about the Great American Outdoors Act. It contained the Land and Water Conservation Fund, right?
Yep.
Authorization, and you said mandatory funding.
Mandatory spending, yeah.
Spending. And so where do we go next? What's one of the other best examples or most notable examples of a conservation or policy success this past year?
Yeah, the Great American Outdoors Act gets a lot of attention, but what people might have missed was later in the year, I think it was around October, we were able to pass the American Conservation Enhancement Act. And that was a critically important bill for Ducks Unlimited. What that bill did was, one, it reauthorized the North American Wetlands Conservation Act for a really long time. Now, earlier you talked about authorizations. If you're authorized, you don't necessarily get your money spent. NAWCA had not been reauthorized. We had been getting unauthorized appropriations since, I think, 2012, about a decade. And so we reauthorized NAWCA, and we said we were able to get that authorization increased by $10 million. So the ACE Act, the American Conservation Enhancement Act, I'll call it the ACE Act from now on to save us some breath. The ACE Act reauthorized NAWCA for 5 years and increased that authorization by $10 million year over year. So what that means is that's a $50 million increase in authorized spending. And then, but that bill also included a lot of other really important provisions. It included increase in authorization levels for key regional programs like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the Chesapeake Bay Program, the Delaware River Program. And it also created a new program called the Chesapeake Wild Act, which is modeled off of the Delaware River Program, but will provide states in the Chesapeake Bay watershed with funding to do wildlife habitat enhancement and conservation projects with the goal of expanding habitat, but also improving water quality in the Chesapeake Bay.
And all of these programs that we've talked about are ones for which Ducks Unlimited could apply for some of that funding to do some of the habitat conservation work?
That's correct.
Okay. Are there any others at the federal level that we want to talk about here?
There are a lot of other accomplishments at the federal level, but there are two other things that I'd really like to highlight because it points out the importance of our partnerships. And our policy team spends a lot of time building and nurturing partnerships with other groups that have a shared interest in conservation or sustainability or climate mitigation. And so two of the other accomplishments that we had from the last year was one, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the leading trade association for ranchers in the United States, that said that we would work together on sustainability. As Ryan Taylor, our rancher / policy director in North Dakota would say, cows and ducks make great friends. And they really do. And I don't have to tell you that. You're a scientist. You could probably talk for hours about all the great things that cows and ducks do for each other. But that is going to be a great partnership. It solidifies our common commitment to sustainability and multiple uses on ranch lands and the conservation of those family ranches and keeping them on the landscape for the ranchers and for the wildlife. The other one that we signed, a memorandum of common purpose, was, and conservation played a tremendous role. I really have to tip my hat to Dr. Ellen Herbert, who worked a lot on this project, but a memorandum of common purpose with the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. And what that said is that we're going to work with all the cities that are on the Mississippi River on our shared goal of reducing flooding along the Mississippi River through natural infrastructure projects and other multiple use projects. They get access and assistance from our conservation staff and our engineers and biologists and the experts. Most of their communities have 2,500 people or less and 3 full-time employees. They can't process FEMA disaster mitigation grants and other things like that. So this partnership is really going to create an opportunity for us to identify the duckiest projects up and down the Mississippi River that we can help with and what their needs are, and work together to deliver that conservation through natural infrastructure that's also going to prevent a lot of flooding and help with water management, nutrient management, other things like that on the Mississippi River, which I'm sure all of our listeners know is a big problem.
A key thing you've touched on in both of those additional examples is this idea of us increasingly moving, and we've always done this, but it's becoming much more apparent that this is the key to our future, and if we're going to conserve habitats for waterfowl, and that is our ability to work with diverse partners and to find mutually beneficial solutions. And I mean that in the truest sense, where it has to be a win-win. Landowners, ranchers, farmers are going to be they have to be some of our greatest allies going forward. But we have to view that from the perspective of they need to get something out of it too, just as we do for ducks and wetlands and all the habitats, right?
100%. And 70 to 75% of all of the wetlands that are in this country are on private or tribal lands. And so if we want to make an impact on those, we've really got to lean into our relationships with those farmers and ranchers and the agribusiness community and rural communities. A couple of ways that we've done that. We are part of the American Connection Project, which is to just increase broadband in rural America. We realize that that's important for those communities. It's important for conservation. You talk about all the high-tech stuff that our conservation staff utilizes. They need to have access to internet, and rural communities need access to broadband to thrive. Another great example of that is a regional conservation partnership program in the Dakotas that we are working on with a lot of agriculture groups up there to improve soil health. And so what we will do is we'll work with them to draft this federal program, which is a competitive program through USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service, that will provide the resources they need to put on the ground and experiment, if you will, with more sustainable methods of agriculture. We're confident that when they do that, they'll realize that it helps them be better stewards of the land, but most importantly, it helps their bottom line. And that's really the most important thing for family farmers and ranchers on the landscape today. It's a tough environment out there. They've got water problems. Everybody's got too little or too much. We can help with that. We can help with other science-based agronomic science to help them improve their operations and become more profitable.
Yeah, we haven't even really touched on our policy work in the water arena yet, and that could be an episode in itself when we talk about some of the issues that we're facing out west. We've had some water policy, water availability concerns along the Gulf Coast as well, and so that has dominated a lot of the time of many of our policy staff. And so we'll have an opportunity at some point in the future to drill in on those issues in a bit more detail. So let's transition now and talk about some of our policy successes at the state level and how some of our staff have engaged in those decisions and helped influence some favorable outcomes for some policies at the state level.
Our state affairs team and our regional directors and managers of public policy are great at what they do. We couldn't do any of that without our volunteers, as we said before, and also our conservation partners. But we've put a lot of wins on the board over the last year, not just for conservation delivery, but also conservation funding. And most of those accomplishments really kind of fit into a couple of different buckets. The first one would be online raffles. And our freedom, I call this the freedom to fundraise. I know we've got a lot of listeners out there that are like, I'm an event volunteer. What is DU doing for, what's policy doing for fundraising? And I want you to know this, we're really leaning into it. And so over the last year, we legalized online raffles during the pandemic to enable our professional and staff and volunteer fundraisers to really continue to raise the important and essential revenue for conservation. And in a number of states, we legalized online raffles in West Virginia, Nebraska, North Dakota, and a handful of other. South Carolina, we passed a raffle bill that permanently authorized our ability to just conduct charitable raffles at all, which was a big win. The other area that we do a lot of work in on the state side is what we like to refer to as dedicated funding streams. And some of those are state duck stamps. Some of those are state outdoor heritage fund type programs that take excise taxes or other revenue streams and set aside a percentage of that for conservation work. And we've had some big wins there over the last year. I really got to take this opportunity to give a big high five, a big virtual high five to Nell Swenson, who is in Wisconsin, our DU state policy chair and one of our policy committee members up there. That guy has been fighting for a decade to increase the duck stamp in Wisconsin, and this year he did it. Congratulations to you, Nels. But the work that he and our volunteer leaders did in that state not only did that, but they also protected our dedicated funding stream through Wisconsin as well. Similarly protected and incrementally grew our dedicated funding streams in Minnesota through their Outdoor Heritage Fund and in North Dakota and other states like that. And then established new sources of funding. Everyone likes to chuckle a little bit when we talk about this, but in Montana passed a law to legalize recreational marijuana, and it was through a ballot. And the ballot said that tax revenue had to go to conservation. And so our staff and volunteers in Montana succeeded in getting a set aside of more than $5 million that is part of that marijuana excise tax revenue projection that is going to be completely dedicated to permanent easements and the maintenance of permanent easements. And so these types of things, these new revenue streams are just new opportunities for conservation out here in the States. I don't want to blow past the other accomplishments. Because I really want to give a lot of credit to everyone out there. We increased the duck stamp fee in New Jersey. Nobody thought that we were going to be able to do that. I really got another volunteer that deserves a pat on the back. Scott Patterson put that effort on his shoulders and carried it across the finish line. I've never seen a volunteer grind on his state legislators like Scott did, and he deserves a lot of credit, as does Nikki on that one.
And some people may be listening to this thinking, well, wait, why are you raising our fees? In a lot of these cases, duck stamp prices had probably not increased in 20 or 30 years? I mean, it's or longer.
Right. Duck stamp fees in New Jersey had not increased, I think, in over 25 years. And some states index them to inflation. Some states just do incremental fee increases. And these are nominal fee increases. And one of the things that we always do is we survey our members in the landscape and make sure that we have support for these fee increases, because we don't want to make our members or our supporters feel like we're advocating for taxes on duck hunters. But I can say unequivocally that in almost every single circumstance, and this is one of the things that I'm more proud of than anything else about the hunting community, about the sportsman community, about fishermen, hunters, anglers, when there is a reasonable proposal to increase the fees, they always support it because they know that investment goes right back into the landscape. It's going to mean more ducks. It's going to mean more fish. It's going to be more outdoor access on public lands. And because of that, they support those types of investments. And it's really unique. I said this the other day to somebody. Conservation and outdoor recreation is one of the only things that you can tax and get more of it.
Yeah.
It's not a tax, but you increase the cost and people just get more passionate about it, as long as it's reasonable and has the support of the hunting and fishing community.
Right. Reasonable, has the support, and they can see that the money's being used wisely, and they are a direct beneficiary of the expenditure of those funds.
1,000%. And I think that, it really kind of goes full circle back to our relationship with those state fish and wildlife agencies. And people are skeptical of what the government spends money on.
Sure.
The government spends money on a lot of stuff.
People are skeptical of what any body with authority has, what they're spending money on.
100%. But the transparency and the stewardship of those conservation dollars by our partners at the state agencies is essential in building that confidence and support amongst hunters and anglers for these types of initiatives, which are essentially important for our conservation work. And so I really have to tip my hat to all of them out there, all of the biologists, all of the state agency officials, all of our partners out there who work day in and day out to take care of the land, public lands, and some private lands, to make sure that we all have great places to go hunting and fishing.
I interrupted you there a few minutes ago. Are there any other notable state level? I mean, I know there are many more that we could talk about here, but I asked you just to mention a few. We're going to have to start wrapping it up here in just a second. But any others that we've left out that you would feel bad about not mentioning?
Well, there are two that come to mind, and I appreciate you asking. The first one is the H2 Ohio initiative. I really got to give a lot of credit to the legislators and the leadership in Ohio for really leaning into their stewardship of the Great Lakes. They're really trying to clean up the lake up there, and they've invested a lot of conservation dollars, and DEU is an essential partner of that. We've really benefited from that, and the ducks and the fish and all the people that live in Ohio have significantly benefited from that as well. And then lastly, earlier you mentioned water policy. And there's one thing that we've been working on in particular out west. In Northern California, Southern Oregon, they're undergoing one of the most historic droughts in the history of that region. And they've had some good ones before this time, or some really bad ones, comparatively speaking. But, DU went out there. We met with a lot of agriculture leaders. We've met with the community. We've been engaging with tribal leadership. And what had happened is there's a very complicated situation out there in the Klamath Basin. The Klamath Basin was the first ever migratory bird protection area that was established in this country. And so this is an essential wintering ground and area where birds molt and hang out while they're molting. As you are well aware, waterfowl don't have much of a choice but to hang out. All these birds were concentrated in this one little body of remaining water, and it was going to dry up. And there were also 130 or so endangered suckerfish there. And it was going to dry up, and they all probably would have died. And we worked with the local leadership in the ag community. We worked with the Bureau of Reclamation. We worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We worked with other local leaders and community stakeholders. And we were able to deliver water to that area so that we are relatively confident that won't happen, and we'll avoid what would have been a historically cataclysmic avian botulism outbreak. Last year or the year before, there was a avian botulism outbreak due to certain similar circumstances that killed about 60,000 birds. And so I really have to tip my hat to Al Matna and Paul Bonderson and Mark Engstrom and Jeff McCreary, our director of operations in the Western region. And, our other, while I'm naming people.
It's always a dangerous thing once you start, right?
Yeah. Amelia Raquel and Chris Colson, two of our biologists out there, deserve a lot of credit. And so that was an incredible accomplishment by our policy team that really makes a difference for not just the ducks, but also for all the people that live in that basin.
The policy arena within which you and all your team works is certainly diverse. It's immense and it's diverse. You talked about online raffles. That was the one that kind of shocked me whenever I first started hearing about it last year. Is that we were having to devote some policy work, some policy capacity to try to enable online raffles. Of course, that became hyper important as we got into last year with the Zoom world of fundraising. I had no idea that those types of situations would even occur. But you find out really quick when you try to do them, right?
Right. Yeah. You wouldn't expect a DU lobbyist or policy staffer's antenna to pop up when they see a bill about a state lotto law, but it does.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Zach, this has been a a wide-ranging conversation, as all policy conversations, at this level need to be. We haven't even mentioned the Farm Bill once, and we'll have to get you back to talk about that. And I think we're probably about to start gearing up.
Right on the cusp.
So we'll have to get you back to talk about that in a little bit more detail. You did mention the RCPP, which is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. I think I got that right. It is part of the conservation title of the Farm Bill. So we did touch on it tangentially there, but the Farm Bill, the conservation title in it has been one of probably the most significant funding source for wildlife conservation to ever be present here in this country. So we'll definitely have to spend some time talking about that as we go forward. But any closing remarks from you to any of our listeners or audience about policy or anything that we might want to cover here as we close out?
Yeah, if there was only one thing that I could say to all of our listeners and all the DU supporters across the United States, it would be thank you. Thank you for everything that you do day in and day out to make the Duckhead the most recognizable, most trusted, most respected brand in science-based conservation, because that reputation is the bedrock of everything that we do. When we walk into a legislator's office and we say we're here from Ducks Unlimited, they know that we're trustworthy. They know that we have an army of 1 million supporters across the United States that care about our priorities. And they know that they're going to start with wanting to say yes to whatever it is that we ask for because of all of those things. And so thank you to everybody for everything you do. It doesn't just stop at the policy committee edge, if you will. It is the cumulative work that everyone in this company and all of our volunteers and supporters across the U.S. do every day to promote the Duckhead and promote DU brand reputation and make it the most trusted, most adored brand in conservation in the United States. So thanks to all of you for what you do. Keep it up.
And I echo that. And Zach, thank you, and thank your entire team and on all our volunteers for their work towards advancing our policy priorities. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast.
Will do. Thank you, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Zach Hartman, our Chief Policy Officer. We greatly appreciate his time in filling us in on a little bit about policy and what our priorities are and what some of our notable accomplishments have been. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the work he does on the podcast. And to you, our listeners, we thank you for joining us, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.